Have you ever wondered what secrets can do to love when war tears the world apart? This is the story of two hearts that beat as one until the greatest conflict in human history forced them to choose between duty and devotion. Picture this: New York City, 1942. The smell of fresh bagels mixing with exhaust fumes on busy streets, young couples dancing to Glenn Miller at the Seavoy Ballroom. Everyone trying to forget, if only for a moment, that somewhere across the Atlantic, boys their age are dying in muddy trenches. This was the world where Margaret Sullivan first laid eyes on Frank Morrison. She was 22, fresh out of nursing school, with auburn hair that caught the light just right, and a smile that could make even the grumpiest hospital patient forget their pain. Frank was 24, an aspiring journalist who wrote for the local paper, covering everything from baseball games to city council meetings. He had these intense green eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They met on a Tuesday evening in Central Park. Margaret was walking home from her shift at Bellevue Hospital when it started to rain. Frank happened to be sitting on a bench, scribbling notes for his next article, when he saw this beautiful woman trying to shield herself under a tree that barely had any leaves left. Without thinking twice, he ran over and offered his umbrella. What happened next changed everything. They talked for hours under that umbrella, completely soaked but not caring one bit. Margaret told him about her dreams of traveling the world as a nurse, helping people wherever they needed it most. Frank shared his passion for telling stories that mattered, stories that could make people understand what was really happening in the world. By the time the rain stopped, they both knew something extraordinary had begun. Frank walked her home, and before they said goodbye, he asked if he could see her again. Margaret said yes, without hesitation. That simple word launched a love story that would span continents and survive secrets that could have destroyed them both. For the next 6 months, they were inseparable. Frank would wait outside the hospital after Margaret's shifts with flowers he picked from the park. Margaret would sneak into the newspaper office during her lunch breaks just to watch Frank work, fascinated by how his fingers flew across the typewriter keys. They would spend entire Sundays walking through the city, discovering hidden corners and sharing dreams that seemed perfectly within reach. Frank taught Margaret how to see stories everywhere. The elderly man feeding pigeons had fought in the Great War. The young mother pushing a stroller was probably worrying about her husband overseas. The newspaper boy shouting headlines was supporting his entire family. Margaret showed Frank how to notice the small acts of kindness that happened every day. The nurse who stayed late to comfort a scared patient. The doctor who used his own money to buy medicine for someone who couldn't afford it. The janitor who always had a joke ready to cheer up the night shift. They made each other better people. Frank started writing more compassionate stories, focusing on the human side of every news event. Margaret became more confident in her work, inspired by Frank's belief that everyone had something important to contribute to the world. But here's where everything gets complicated. Frank had a secret, one that he kept buried so deep that sometimes he almost forgot about it himself. Before he met Margaret, before he became a journalist, Frank had been recruited by the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was America's wartime intelligence agency, the predecessor to what would later become the CIA. Frank's job was simple on the surface, but devastating in practice. He was supposed to maintain his cover as a regular journalist while gathering intelligence about potential German sympathizers in New York. The government suspected that Nazi agents were operating throughout American cities, recruiting locals and gathering information about military operations. Frank's assignment was to identify these networks and report back to his handlers. The terrible irony was that Frank had gotten into journalism because he believed in truth and transparency. Now he was living a lie every single day. Every story he wrote, every conversation he had, every moment he spent with Margaret was tainted by this deception. He told himself it was for the greater good, that he was protecting his country and the woman he loved. But late at night, when Margaret slept peacefully beside him, Frank would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he was becoming the very thing he despised. Margaret had no idea about any of this. To her, Frank was exactly who he appeared to be, a passionate writer who cared about justice and wanted to make the world a better place through his work. She admired his integrity, his dedication to getting the facts right, his refusal to write sensational stories just to sell papers. If she had known that half of Frank's articles were carefully crafted to flush out enemy agents, if she had known that their romantic walks through the city were actually surveillance missions, if she had known that Frank was reporting on their friends and neighbors to government handlers, everything would have fallen apart. The weight of this secret grew heavier every day. Frank found himself creating elaborate stories to explain his absences when he had to meet with his OSS contact. He memorized Margaret's schedule so he could conduct his real work when she wasn't around. He started keeping 2 sets of notes, one for his legitimate newspaper articles and another coded set for his intelligence reports. The man Margaret fell in love with was real, but he was only part of the truth. Then came the night that changed everything. It was March 15th, 1943, almost exactly 1 year after they had first met in the rain. Frank had just finished a particularly difficult assignment that required him to befriend a German-American family suspected of harboring Nazi sympathizers. The investigation had taken weeks, and Frank had discovered that the family was completely innocent. They were just immigrants trying to build a new life in America, terrified of being persecuted because of their heritage. Frank filed his report, clearing the family of any wrongdoing, but the experience left him shaken. He realized that his secret work was destroying his faith in everything he believed about justice and truth. He was investigating innocent people, violating their privacy, and betraying their trust. Worse than that, he was lying to Margaret every single day about who he really was and what he really did. That night, Frank made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to tell Margaret everything. He couldn't live with the deception anymore, and he couldn't build a future with her based on lies. He loved her too much to keep pretending, and he respected her too much to deny her the right to know who she was really in love with. Frank planned it all out carefully. He would take Margaret to their special place in Central Park, the exact spot where they had first met. He would tell her about his work with the OSS, explain why he had kept it secret, and ask for her forgiveness. He would give her the choice to walk away if she couldn't handle the truth, even though the thought of losing her was almost unbearable. But Frank never got the chance to have that conversation. The morning he planned to confess everything, Margaret came to him with news that turned their world upside down. She had been selected for a special nursing program that would send her to England to work with wounded soldiers being evacuated from the European front. It was an incredible honor, a chance to serve her country and use her skills where they were needed most. The program would last at least 2 years, possibly longer if the war continued. Margaret was torn between excitement and heartbreak. This was everything she had dreamed of, the chance to make a real difference in the world. But it also meant leaving Frank behind with no guarantee of when or if they would see each other again. She looked at Frank with tears in her eyes and asked him what she should do. Frank felt like his world was crumbling. Just when he had decided to be honest with Margaret, fate was forcing them apart anyway. He could have asked her to stay, could have told her about his secret work and begged her not to leave him. But looking into her eyes, seeing how much this opportunity meant to her, Frank realized that loving someone sometimes meant letting them follow their dreams, even when it destroyed your own. So Frank smiled, took Margaret's hands in his, and told her she had to go. He said it was her chance to be the incredible nurse he always knew she could be. He promised to write every day and to wait for her no matter how long the war lasted. He made her promise to be careful and to remember how much he loved her. What Frank didn't tell Margaret was that his own situation was about to become much more complicated. His handlers at the OSS had been impressed with his work in New York, and they were planning to send him on a much more dangerous assignment. Frank would be going to France to work with the French resistance, gathering intelligence about German troop movements in preparation for what everyone hoped would be the liberation of Western Europe. Both Frank and Margaret were about to cross the Atlantic, heading toward the same war but from completely different directions. Neither of them knew that their paths would eventually lead them to the beaches of Normandy, where secrets would finally surface and love would face its greatest test. Margaret sailed for England on April 3, 1943. Frank watched from the dock as her ship disappeared into the gray Atlantic, carrying away the best part of his life. 3 weeks later, Frank received his orders for France. As he prepared for his own journey across the ocean, Frank wrote Margaret one last letter from New York. In it, he told her how proud he was of her courage and how much he admired her dedication to helping others. What he didn't tell her was that he might never come back, and that if he did survive the war, he would still be carrying secrets that could destroy everything they had built together. This is where our story truly begins, with two lovers separated by an ocean and bound together by secrets that neither of them fully understands. Margaret's journey would take her from the hospitals of London to the beaches of Normandy, where she would discover that healing sometimes requires more than medical training. Frank's path would lead him deep into occupied France, where he would learn that the truth can be more dangerous than any lie. The war was about to teach them both that love isn't just about the promises you make when times are good. It's about the choices you face when everything you believe in is tested by impossible circumstances. Margaret's ship, the HMS Britannica, cut through the Atlantic waters like a knife through silk. For 7 days, she stood at the rail watching endless gray waves, clutching Frank's last letter until the paper grew soft from her touch. The other nurses aboard spoke excitedly about their mission, but Margaret found herself lost in memories of dancing at the Seavoy and sharing umbrella-covered conversations in Central Park. England greeted her with rain and the smell of coal smoke hanging heavy over London. The city bore scars from the Blitz, with entire blocks reduced to rubble and gaps in the skyline like missing teeth. Margaret was assigned to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where she quickly discovered that nursing in wartime demanded skills they never taught in school. The wounded arrived daily, sometimes hourly, young men with eyes older than their years, speaking in accents from across the British Empire, Canadian pilots with burned hands, Australian infantry with shattered legs, American boys who cried for their mothers in the darkness. Margaret learned to change dressings while bombs fell in the distance. She mastered the art of comforting dying soldiers with words she barely believed herself. But it was during those long nights in the hospital ward that Margaret began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Certain patients received visits from men in civilian clothes who asked unusual questions. Some wounded soldiers were transferred to different facilities without medical explanation. Medical supplies arrived with shipping manifests that listed destinations Margaret had never heard of. Strange documents passed between doctors and nurses, documents that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Margaret's supervisor, Sister Catherine, was a stern woman who had served in the Great War. She took Margaret aside one evening after a particularly brutal day of casualties. Sister Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper as she explained that their hospital was more than just a medical facility. They were treating not only regular wounded soldiers, but also men involved in special operations, missions so secret that even their medical records were classified. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. She was working in the middle of a web of secrets and lies, treating patients whose very presence endangered everyone around them. Some of the men she nursed back to health would be returning to occupied territories, risking their lives to gather intelligence or coordinate with resistance fighters. Others were escaped prisoners of war who carried information vital to Allied operations. Margaret found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her purpose in England. She had come to heal and comfort, but now she was part of something much larger and more dangerous. Every patient she treated, every conversation she overheard, every document she glimpsed added another piece to a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Frank was discovering his own harsh truths about the nature of war and deception. His journey to France had been unlike anything he could have imagined. Instead of sailing directly across, Frank had been smuggled through a network of safe houses in Scotland, then transferred to a fishing boat, that carried him to the coast of Brittany under cover of darkness. The French resistance was not the romantic organization Frank had envisioned from his comfortable desk in New York. These were ordinary people driven to extraordinary measures by desperation and rage. Farmers who planted bombs instead of crops. Shopkeepers who smuggled weapons instead of selling bread. Teachers who coded messages instead of grading papers. They lived in constant fear of betrayal, knowing that a single mistake could lead to torture and death for themselves and everyone they loved. Frank's contact in France was a woman known only as Celeste. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and hands scarred from factory work. Celeste had lost her husband in the early days of the occupation and her eldest son to a German firing squad. She spoke English with a thick accent, but her intelligence was sharp as broken glass. Within minutes of meeting Frank, she made it clear that his survival depended entirely on following her instructions without question. The work was nothing like Frank had expected. Instead of gathering grand strategic intelligence, he found himself documenting the mundane details of German daily routines. Which soldiers visited which cafes at what times, how many trucks passed through specific intersections during the night, where guards were stationed and when they changed shifts. The information seemed trivial, but Celeste explained that these small details would eventually form a pattern that could save thousands of Allied lives. Frank's cover story was simple but dangerous. He posed as a Swiss journalist writing about French culture during wartime. The identity gave him reason to travel and ask questions, but it also made him conspicuous. German officers were suspicious of foreign journalists, and French collaborators were eager to prove their loyalty by reporting unusual behavior. Frank walked a razor's edge every day, knowing that one wrong word or gesture could expose not only himself but the entire resistance cell that had risked everything to shelter him. The hardest part wasn't the constant danger or the primitive living conditions. It was the moral complexity of his situation. Frank watched ordinary French citizens make impossible choices between survival and resistance. He saw families torn apart by conflicting loyalties. He witnessed acts of heroism and cowardice, sometimes from the same person on the same day. The clear lines between right and wrong that had seemed so obvious in New York became blurred in the gray reality of occupied France. Every night, Frank wrote coded reports for transmission back to his OSS handlers in London, but he also wrote letters to Margaret, letters he could never send, pouring out his heart about the things he was seeing and doing. In those unsent letters, Frank struggled with the growing realization that he was becoming someone Margaret wouldn't recognize. The idealistic journalist who had fallen in love with a beautiful nurse in Central Park was disappearing, replaced by a man who had learned to lie convincingly, to kill when necessary, and to betray trust as a tool of survival. Frank kept Margaret's photograph in his coat pocket next to his false identity papers. Some nights, by candlelight in whatever safe house was sheltering him, he would stare at her picture and try to remember what it felt like to be honest with someone he loved. He would imagine their reunion after the war, trying to picture himself explaining where he had been and what he had done. The conversations he imagined never ended well. As winter turned to spring in 1944, both Margaret and Frank began to sense that something significant was approaching. In London, military activity increased dramatically. Hospitals received urgent requests to expand their capacity. Medical supplies were stockpiled in quantities that suggested massive casualties were expected soon. Margaret and her fellow nurses were given intensive training in treating specific types of battlefield injuries, preparation that could only mean one thing. A major invasion was being planned. Frank noticed similar preparations in France, but from the opposite perspective. German fortifications along the coast were reinforced with desperate urgency. Troop movements increased, and new defensive positions appeared seemingly overnight. Resistance activities intensified, with sabotage operations targeting communication lines and supply routes. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire continent was holding its breath before an explosion. Neither Margaret nor Frank knew that their paths were converging toward the same destination. The massive operation being planned would bring Allied forces across the Channel to establish a foothold in occupied Europe. The beaches of Normandy would become the stage where their separate wars would finally intersect, where secrets would surface like bodies washing ashore, and where love would face its ultimate test. Margaret received her new assignment on May 15, 1944. She would be part of the medical team supporting Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. Her nursing skills would be needed on the beaches themselves, treating wounded soldiers as they came ashore under enemy fire. The assignment was voluntary, and Margaret was warned that the casualties would be unprecedented. Many of the medical personnel assigned to the landing forces would not survive the first day. Margaret accepted without hesitation. This was why she had come to England, why she had left Frank behind in New York. She would be where her skills were needed most, helping to save lives during the most crucial operation of the war. She wrote Frank a letter that night, knowing it might be the last one he ever received from her. In it, she told him about her love for him, her pride in serving their country, and her hope that they would be reunited when the war finally ended. She sealed the letter but kept it in her pocket, planning to mail it just before the invasion began. Frank's final mission briefing came 3 days later. He would be part of a coordinated effort to support the invasion by disrupting German communications and transportation networks behind enemy lines. His team would operate in the area immediately inland from the Normandy beaches, creating chaos and confusion to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. It was a suicide mission disguised as a strategic operation, and everyone involved understood the odds of survival. As Frank prepared for what he assumed would be his last assignment, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He wrote a complete confession, detailing his work with the OSS and his deception of Margaret. He sealed the letter and gave it to Celeste with instructions to mail it to Margaret if he didn't survive the invasion. Frank couldn't bear the thought of dying with his secrets intact, leaving Margaret to mourn a man who had never really existed. The stage was set for a collision of love and duty, truth and deception, hope and despair. Two people who had promised to wait for each other were about to discover that some promises are harder to keep than others, and that war has a way of forcing even the most devoted lovers to choose between their hearts and their honor. The morning of June 5th arrived gray and restless, with clouds hanging low over the English Channel like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret stood in the pre-dawn darkness at Portsmouth Harbor, watching landing craft bob in the choppy water like restless animals. Around her, hundreds of medical personnel checked and rechecked their supplies, their voices hushed with the weight of what was coming. She had barely slept in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Frank's face as it had looked that last morning in New York, when he kissed her goodbye at the hospital steps. She wondered if he was thinking about her tonight, somewhere in that distant city where their love story had begun. Margaret pulled his photograph from her pocket, the edges worn soft from countless viewings, and whispered a prayer that somehow he would know she was thinking of him too. The other nurses moved around her like ghosts, their faces pale in the artificial light. Sister Catherine approached, her weathered hands steady as always despite what lay ahead. She placed a gentle touch on Margaret's shoulder, understanding without words the storm of emotions churning beneath her calm exterior. The briefing had been stark and honest. They would land on the beaches within hours of the initial assault, setting up field hospitals directly behind the advancing troops. The casualties would be immediate and overwhelming. Some of the wounded would die before they could be treated. Others would live only because of decisions made in seconds under enemy fire. Every nurse going ashore understood that they might not return to England, but they also understood that their presence could mean the difference between life and death for countless soldiers. Margaret thought about the young men she had treated in London, boys who had survived their first taste of combat only to be sent back for more. Tonight, thousands more just like them were preparing to storm those beaches, carrying with them letters from sweethearts and photographs of families they might never see again. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Across the channel, Frank crouched in a barn outside the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, cleaning his weapon by the light of a single candle. The past year in occupied France had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. His hands bore scars from close calls with German patrols. His eyes held shadows that hadn't been there when he kissed Margaret goodbye in Central Park. The idealistic young journalist who had believed in the power of truth had learned hard lessons about the necessity of deception. Celeste sat across from him studying maps marked with German positions and patrol routes. She had become more than his resistance contact over these months. She was his anchor to humanity in a world gone mad, the person who reminded him that beneath all the lies and violence, there were still people worth fighting for. Tonight, she would coordinate the sabotage operations that would support the invasion, knowing that success or failure might depend on timing, measured in minutes. Frank's team consisted of 6 men, each carrying enough explosives to level a bridge or derail a train. Their mission was elegantly simple and impossibly dangerous. As Allied forces hit the beaches, Frank's group would systematically destroy every major road and rail junction between Caen and the coast. If they succeeded, German reinforcements would be delayed by hours, maybe even days. If they failed, the invasion force would face coordinated counterattacks that could drive them back into the sea. The photograph of Margaret remained in Frank's breast pocket next to his false identity papers and a small notebook filled with coded observations. He had written her name on the first page of that notebook in letters so faint they were barely visible. Sometimes during the loneliest moments of his exile, he would trace those letters with his finger and remember what it felt like to love someone without reservation, without secrets, without the constant weight of deception. Frank wondered if Margaret would recognize the man he had become. The gentle writer who had shared umbrellas and dreams now knew how to set explosives, how to kill silently, how to lie convincingly enough to save his own life and the lives of others. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to function effectively while carrying guilt that threatened to crush him. The war had made him useful in ways that would have horrified the person he used to be. As midnight approached, both Margaret and Frank made their final preparations for the most important day of their lives. Margaret packed her medical bag with practiced efficiency, each instrument and bandage placed exactly where muscle memory could find it in darkness or chaos. She wrote a quick note to her parents, telling them she was proud to serve and asking them to remember her fondly if she didn't return. The letter joined Frank's. Photograph in her uniform pocket, 2 pieces of the life she had left behind. Frank checked his equipment one last time, then helped his teammates load their explosive charges into canvas bags that would be strapped to their backs during the long march to their targets. Each man carried enough destructive power to complete the mission alone, insurance against the casualties they all expected to suffer. They synchronized their watches and reviewed their extraction plans, though everyone understood that extraction was more hope than expectation. The weather reports were troubling. High winds and rough seas had already delayed the invasion once, and meteorologists warned the conditions might not improve for days. But the timetables of war rarely accommodate the preferences of weather, and orders had been given. The greatest amphibious assault in military history would proceed regardless of wind and rain. Margaret joined her medical team aboard a converted hospital ship that would follow the assault waves onto the beaches. The vessel was painted white with large red crosses, theoretically protecting it under international law. But everyone aboard knew that desperate men in combat rarely observed such niceties. They would be sailing directly into a battle zone where the rules of civilization had been suspended in favor of survival. The ship's engines rumbled to life just after 2 a.m, joining a convoy that stretched beyond the horizon. Margaret stood at the rail, watching the lights of England fade into darkness behind them. Somewhere in that darkness was the life she had built with Frank, the memories they had created together, the future they had planned before duty called them in different directions. She wondered if she would ever see those familiar shores again, ever walk through Central Park in Frank's arms, ever dance to Glenn Miller at the Savoy. Frank's team began their infiltration at the same time, moving through the French countryside under cover of darkness. They had rehearsed this route dozens of times, memorizing every landmark and hiding place. Tonight, their knowledge would be tested against German patrols that had been reinforced in anticipation of invasion. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and the entire operation would collapse in gunfire and death. The irony was not lost on Frank as he crept through the shadows of occupied France. While Margaret sailed toward danger to save lives, he moved through the night to take them. Both were serving the same cause, fighting the same enemy, but their methods could not have been more different. Margaret would heal with gentle hands and compassionate words. Frank would destroy with calculated violence and necessary betrayal. As dawn approached over the English Channel, both lovers faced the unknown with courage born of duty and love. Margaret prepared to step onto beaches swept by machine gun fire, where her medical skills would be tested against wounds that defied healing. Frank positioned himself to strike at the heart of German communications, knowing that his actions would either support the invasion or contribute to its failure. Neither knew that fate was drawing them toward the same stretch of Norman coast, where their separate wars would finally converge. The secrets Frank had carried for so long were about to surface in the chaos of battle. The innocence Margaret had preserved despite months of treating wounded soldiers was about to be tested by revelations that would challenge everything she believed about the man she loved. The invasion fleet continued its approach through rough seas and uncertain weather. Thousands of young men checked their weapons and said silent prayers, while medical personnel prepared for casualties that would arrive faster than they could be treated. In the darkness before dawn, love and duty, truth and deception, hope and despair moved toward their inevitable collision on the beaches of Normandy. Frank completed his final approach to the first target, a railway junction that connected German strongholds along the coast. His hands worked automatically, placing explosive charges with the precision of long practice. But his mind wandered to Margaret, wondering where she was at this moment. Whether she was safe, whether she still believed in the man he had pretended to be. Margaret secured her medical supplies as the hospital ship approached the Norman coast. Through the porthole, she could see the first gray light of dawn, revealing a coastline that would soon be transformed by battle. In her pocket, Frank's photograph pressed against her heart, a talisman against the darkness that was coming. The greatest test of their love was about to begin, though neither yet understood the price that would be demanded of them both. The explosions began at exactly 5:37 in the morning, a symphony of destruction that announced the beginning of the end for Nazi-occupied Europe. Frank's charges detonated in perfect sequence, severing rail lines and collapsing bridges with mathematical precision. Miles away, similar explosions echoed across the Norman countryside as other resistance teams executed their coordinated assault on German supply routes. Frank felt the ground shake beneath his feet as the railway junction disappeared in a cloud of smoke and twisted metal. There was no satisfaction in the destruction, only grim necessity. Each severed connection meant German reinforcements would arrive minutes or hours later than planned. Those delays would be measured in Allied lives saved, though Frank would never know the exact count. His team moved immediately toward their second target, a communications hub that coordinated German defensive positions along the coast. Speed was everything now. The explosions had announced their presence to every German patrol in the region. They had perhaps 30 minutes before enemy forces would converge on their location. As they ran through the pre-dawn darkness, Frank thought about the letter he had entrusted to Celeste. If he died today, Margaret would finally learn the truth about who he really was and what he had been doing all these months. The thought terrified him more than the prospect of capture and execution. He could face death with reasonable courage, but the idea of Margaret reading his confession, understanding the depth of his deception, filled him with a dread that made his hands shake as he prepared the next set of charges. Meanwhile, Margaret's hospital ship approached Omaha Beach through seas churned white by naval bombardment. The sound was unlike anything she had experienced, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Through the ship's windows, she could see the coastline erupting in fountains of sand and smoke as Allied artillery prepared the way for the infantry assault. The first landing craft were already approaching the beach, tiny boats filled with young men who would soon need every skill Margaret possessed. She watched through binoculars as machine gun tracers began to arc down from the German positions, bright lines of death cutting through the gray morning air. Some of the landing craft disappeared in explosions that sent bodies tumbling into the surf. Margaret's training took over, suppressing the horror of what she was witnessing. Each explosion meant wounded men who would need immediate treatment. Each machine gun burst meant torn flesh that would require careful stitching. Each artillery shell meant burns and shrapnel wounds that would test every technique she had learned. This was why she had come to France, why she had left Frank behind in New York. These boys needed her skills more than she needed her own safety. The hospital ship dropped anchor just beyond the range of German artillery, close enough to receive casualties, but far enough to avoid becoming a target itself. Margaret and her medical team prepared to transfer to smaller boats that would carry them directly onto the beach. The irony was not lost on her that she was about to step onto enemy-held territory armed with nothing more than bandages and morphine. Sister Catherine gathered the medical team for final instructions. Her voice remained steady despite the chaos erupting around them, a lifetime of military nursing having prepared her for moments like this. She reminded them that their job was to save lives, not to judge how those lives had been lived or what they had done in service to their countries. Every wounded man who reached their aid station would receive the best care they could provide, regardless of which uniform he wore. Margaret nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. In the chaos of battle, enemy and ally often became indistinguishable when reduced to bleeding flesh and broken bones. A German boy crying for his mother was no different from an American boy crying for his. Pain recognized no nationality, and healing acknowledged no borders. As her boat approached the beach, Margaret could see the full scope of the carnage unfolding before her. Bodies floated in the surf, some moving weakly, others still and silent. Landing craft burned like funeral pyres, their cargo of hopes and dreams reduced to smoke and memory. Young men crawled across the sand, leaving trails of blood behind them as they sought shelter that didn't exist. The boat's hull scraped against the sand with a grinding sound that cut through even the thunder of artillery. Margaret stepped into knee-deep water that was stained pink with blood, her medical bag held high above her head. Around her, other nurses and medics waded ashore, their white armbands with red crosses making them visible targets for any German sniper who chose to ignore the rules of war. Margaret's first patient was a boy who couldn't have been older than 19, his leg nearly severed by shrapnel from a mortar round. She knelt beside him in the sand, working quickly to apply a tourniquet, while he screamed for his mother in a voice that broke her heart. His blood soaked through her uniform as she fought to save a life that might end anyway within the hour. More wounded arrived faster than she could treat them. Boys with faces blown away, their features unrecognizable but their eyes still pleading for help. Men with stomach wounds that steamed in the cool morning air, their life slowly leaking out onto the Norman sand. Soldiers with burns so severe that Margaret had to look away for a moment to compose herself before beginning treatment. Each patient became a small war between death and duty. Margaret found herself making impossible decisions, choosing which wounds to treat first based on who had the best chance of survival. Some boys she could save with quick action and steady hands. Others she could only comfort with morphine and gentle words as they died far from home. The German artillery found their range just after 7 o'clock, and shells began falling among the medical stations. Margaret threw herself over a wounded soldier as shrapnel whistled overhead, her body becoming a shield against metal fragments that could kill them both. The boy beneath her was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid, but he was alive because she had chosen to protect him instead of seeking her own safety. Sister Catherine appeared through the smoke, her uniform torn and bloody, but her hands still steady as she helped Margaret move the wounded soldier to a more protected position. Together, they worked to stabilize his condition, their conversation reduced to medical terminology and urgent whispers. There was no time for fear, no space for doubt. Only the endless procession of broken bodies that needed their skills. 20 miles inland, Frank's team reached their final target just as the sun broke through the morning clouds. The communications center was heavily defended, surrounded by concrete bunkers and machine gun nests that would make their approach nearly impossible. But the radio antennas rising above the compound represented the nerve center of German coastal defenses. Destroying them would blind enemy commanders at the most crucial moment of the battle. Frank studied the defenses through binoculars, calculating angles of approach and probable casualty rates. Half his team would likely die in the assault, maybe more. The mathematics of war were brutal and precise, measuring human lives against strategic objectives with cold efficiency. Frank had learned to make such calculations without flinching, though each decision carved away another piece of his soul. His team moved into position with practiced silence, each man understanding his role in the coordinated attack. Frank would lead the assault on the main bunker while his teammates created diversions and covered his approach. They had perhaps 10 minutes before German reinforcements would arrive from nearby positions. 10 minutes to destroy the communications hub and escape into the countryside, or 10 minutes to die trying. The assault began with grenades thrown simultaneously into 3 different bunkers. Frank sprinted across open ground while machine guns chattered behind him, his teammates drawing enemy fire away from his approach. He reached the main building and placed his largest charge against the base of the central antenna tower, his hands working automatically despite the bullets whistling around his position. The explosion that followed was spectacular and devastating. The antenna tower toppled like a falling tree, crushing 2 bunkers beneath its weight and severing communications with German headquarters. Secondary explosions erupted as ammunition stores caught fire, turning the compound into an inferno that would burn for hours. Frank's team began their withdrawal immediately, knowing that their success had marked them for death if they were captured. German patrols would be converging on their position within minutes, and their only hope lay in reaching the extraction point before enemy forces could organize a proper pursuit. As they ran through the Norman countryside, Frank felt a strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. The mission had succeeded beyond their best expectations, but 2 of his teammates had died in the assault. Good men who had fought for freedom were now lying in German bunkers, their bodies becoming part of the rubble they had helped create. Frank carried their dog tags in his pocket, metal reminders of the price paid for each small victory. Back on Omaha Beach, Margaret worked through the morning in a haze of blood and morphine, her hands moving from patient to patient with mechanical precision. She had lost count of the lives she had saved and the lives she had been unable to save. Time became meaningless, measured only by the rhythm of breathing and the pulse of heartbeats beneath her fingers. The breakthrough came just after noon when American forces finally pushed inland from the beach. The German machine gun nests that had dominated the landing zones fell silent one by one, their crews either dead or retreating toward prepared positions further inland. The immediate crisis was over, but the wounded continued to arrive in waves. Margaret found a brief moment to rest, sitting on an overturned ammunition crate while she cleaned blood from her hands. Around her, the beach was littered with the debris of war. Abandoned equipment, empty medical containers, and too many bodies covered by blankets. The tide was coming in, washing away the bloodstains, but not the memories they represented. She pulled Frank's photograph from her pocket, the image now stained with the blood of boys she had tried to save. His face smiled back at her from that distant world of Central Park walks and Seavoy Ballroom dances, a world that seemed impossibly far away from this beach of death and sacrifice. Margaret wondered if Frank was thinking about her today, if he was safe in his New York newsroom, if he still believed in the future they had planned together. What Margaret didn't know was that Frank was less than 5 miles away, moving through the same Norman countryside where she was saving lives. His team had successfully reached their extraction point, but instead of immediate evacuation, They had been ordered to remain in place and continue harassing German supply lines. The invasion was succeeding, but victory would require sustained pressure on enemy communications and transportation networks. Frank established a temporary base in an abandoned farmhouse, using the cellar as both shelter and operations center. From there, he coordinated with other resistance teams, planning sabotage operations that would support the Allied advance inland. His radio crackled with coded messages from London, updates on the invasion's progress that filled him with cautious optimism. But success came with unexpected complications. German counterintelligence had identified several resistance networks, and mass arrests were beginning throughout the region. Celeste's group had been compromised, and she was now on the run with German forces closing in on her position. Frank faced a terrible choice: maintain his cover and continue the mission, or risk everything to help the woman who had kept him alive for the past year. Frank's decision revealed how much the war had changed him. The idealistic journalist who had fallen in love in Central Park would have chosen rescue without hesitation. But the intelligence operative who had learned to survive in occupied France understood that individual lives had to be weighed against strategic objectives. Frank continued his mission, knowing that Celeste would understand and approve of his choice, even as it tore at his conscience. The moral complexity of his situation deepened when Frank received intelligence about a German field hospital that had been established near his position. The facility was treating wounded German soldiers, but intelligence reports suggested it was also being used to interrogate captured Allied personnel. Frank's orders were clear. The hospital represented a legitimate military target and should be destroyed. But Margaret's influence on his thinking couldn't be completely suppressed. Frank found himself unable to coordinate an attack on a medical facility, regardless of its military significance. Instead, he reported the hospital's location to Allied intelligence, recommending surveillance rather than destruction. The decision might have strategic consequences, but Frank couldn't bring himself to target doctors and nurses who were trying to save lives, even enemy lives. As afternoon turned to evening on June 6th, both Margaret and Frank continued their separate wars within the larger conflict. Margaret worked by candlelight in a field hospital that had been established in a damaged church, treating wounded soldiers by the dozens as they were carried in from the advancing front lines. Her hands had steadied after the initial shock of combat, and she found a rhythm that allowed her to function despite the horror surrounding her. Frank monitored German radio communications from his farmhouse hideout, gathering intelligence about enemy troop movements and defensive preparations. The information he collected would be transmitted to Allied commanders, helping them plan the next phase of their advance inland. But each intercepted message also revealed the human cost of the invasion, German reports of casualties and desperate requests for reinforcement that painted a picture of an army under enormous pressure. Both lovers were discovering that war had a way of revealing character in unexpected ways. Margaret found reserves of strength and courage she hadn't known she possessed, enabling her to function effectively in circumstances that would have overwhelmed her civilian self. Frank discovered that his capacity for deception and violence ran deeper than he had ever imagined, skills that kept him alive but changed him in fundamental ways. Neither yet understood that their paths were converging toward a collision that would test not only their individual courage, but the foundation of their love itself. The secrets Frank had carried for so long were about to surface in ways he could never have anticipated. Margaret's faith in the man she had fallen in love with was about to face its greatest challenge. The war was far from over, but the invasion had succeeded. Allied forces were establishing a foothold in Western Europe that would eventually lead to victory. But for Margaret and Frank, the real battle was just beginning. Soon they would discover that some wounds cut deeper than shrapnel, some secrets are more dangerous than enemy fire, and some choices between love and duty leave scars that never fully heal. The stage was set for a reunion neither had expected, under circumstances that would challenge everything they thought they knew about each other and themselves. The dawn of June 7th brought a deceptive quiet to the Norman countryside, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of sniper fire. Margaret had worked through the night without rest, her hands moving automatically from wound to wound while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of human suffering she had witnessed. The makeshift field hospital in the damaged church had become a cathedral of pain, where prayers mixed with morphine and hope battled against despair. She stepped outside for her first breath of fresh air in 18 hours, her uniform stained with the blood of boys who would never see home again. The morning light revealed a landscape transformed by war. Craters pocked the fields where shells had fallen. Abandoned equipment littered the countryside like the bones of some mechanical beast. Smoke rose from burning vehicles and buildings, creating a haze that turned the sun into a pale orange disk. Margaret walked among the graves that had been hastily dug behind the church, each marked with the simple wooden cross and a pair of dog tags. American names mixed with British ones, boys from farms and cities who had died far from everything they had ever known. She read each name silently, wondering about the families who would soon receive telegrams that would destroy their worlds with a few carefully chosen words. A young soldier approached, his arm in a makeshift sling and his eyes holding that hollow look Margaret had learned to recognize. He was walking wounded, stable enough to move but too injured for immediate return to combat. These boys often struggled the most, caught between the relief of survival and the guilt of leaving their comrades behind. The soldier's name was Tommy, and he was 19 years old, the same age Margaret had been when she first dreamed of becoming a nurse. He had been shot through the shoulder during the beach assault, the bullet missing major arteries by millimeters. Margaret had treated him during those chaotic first hours, working by feel in the darkness while shells exploded around them. Tommy thanked her quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of gunfire. He told her about his squad, about friends who hadn't made it off the beach, about the machine gun nest that had cut them down like wheat before a scythe. His words came in broken fragments, as if the memories were too painful to form into complete sentences. Margaret listened without judgment, offering the kind of comfort that couldn't be measured in medical terms. She had learned that healing involved more than treating physical wounds. Sometimes the most important thing she could do was simply bear witness to someone's pain, acknowledging their loss without trying to diminish it with empty platitudes. As Tommy walked away to rejoin his unit, Margaret realized how much she had changed since leaving New York. The idealistic young woman who had fallen in love with Frank's gentle nature now understood that gentleness alone couldn't heal the world. Sometimes healing required the kind of strength that could look directly at horror without flinching, that could function effectively while surrounded by death and despair. She thought about Frank's letters, wondering what he would make of the person she was becoming. Would he recognize the woman who could amputate a shattered limb without hesitation? Would he understand how she had learned to make life and death decisions in seconds, weighing one patient's chances against another's with cold calculation? The war was teaching her skills that had never been covered in nursing school, skills that would mark her forever. 20 miles away, Frank was learning his own harsh lessons about the person war could make you become. His team had spent the night monitoring German radio traffic, intercepting communications that revealed the enemy's growing desperation. German commanders were requesting reinforcements that didn't exist, reporting casualties they couldn't replace, describing defensive positions that were crumbling under sustained Allied pressure. But the intercepted messages also revealed something else: the locations of German field hospitals and aid stations. Frank found himself in possession of intelligence that could be used to target medical facilities, eliminating enemy treatment capabilities while inflicting maximum psychological damage on German forces. The information represented a tactical advantage that could shorten the war and save Allied lives. Yet Frank couldn't bring himself to pass along the hospital locations to his handlers. Every time he prepared to transmit the coordinates, he thought about Margaret working in similar conditions, trying to save lives while bombs fell around her. The idea of deliberately targeting medical personnel violated something fundamental in his nature, even though he understood the military logic behind such actions. Frank's reluctance to exploit medical intelligence created tension with his OSS superiors. During his scheduled radio contact, his handler expressed frustration with Frank's selective reporting, questioning his commitment to the mission. Frank found himself defending his choices without revealing the personal reasons behind them, walking a careful line between duty and conscience. The conversation ended with new orders that filled Frank with dread. Intelligence had identified a German communication hub located in what appeared to be a civilian hospital. The facility was treating wounded German soldiers while also coordinating defensive operations throughout the region. Frank's team was ordered to infiltrate the hospital and destroy the communication equipment, regardless of civilian casualties. Frank studied the reconnaissance photographs with growing unease. The building was clearly marked with red crosses indicating its medical status under international law. But the radio antennas on its roof and the military vehicles in its courtyard suggested it was being used for purposes far beyond medical treatment. The facility represented exactly the kind of target that blurred the lines between legitimate military objective and war crime. His team began planning the operation with professional efficiency, identifying entry points and escape routes while calculating the explosive charges needed to destroy the communication equipment. Frank participated in the planning while struggling with doubts that grew stronger with each passing hour. The journalist in him understood that such facilities represented the moral complexity of modern warfare. The intelligence operative in him knew that successful missions sometimes required morally questionable actions. But the man who loved Margaret couldn't escape the image of her working in a similar hospital, trying to save lives while enemy agents planted explosives nearby. The personal and professional aspects of his identity were colliding in ways that threatened to tear him apart. The mission was scheduled for the night of June 8th, giving Frank 24 hours to resolve his internal conflict. He spent the day conducting surveillance of the target, watching medical personnel move between buildings while German officers coordinated defensive operations from the same facility. The dichotomy was stark and troubling. Healers and killers working side by side, their activities protected by the same red crosses that marked Margaret's hospital. Frank's observations revealed additional complications that made the mission even more morally ambiguous. The hospital was treating not only German soldiers, but also French civilians who had been injured during the fighting. Children with shrapnel wounds shared beds with enemy combatants, their pain making no distinction between ally and enemy. Destroying the communication hub would almost certainly result in civilian casualties, including medical personnel who were simply trying to do their jobs. As evening approached, Frank made a decision that would have consequence far beyond the immediate mission. Instead of destroying the communication hub, he would attempt to capture it intact, preserving the medical facility while eliminating its military function. The plan was far more dangerous than simple demolition, requiring his team to infiltrate the building, neutralize the German operators, and hold the position long enough to extract valuable intelligence. Frank's decision to modify the mission without authorization represented a fundamental change in his relationship with the OSS. He was no longer simply following orders, but making moral judgments that put his team at greater risk while potentially compromising strategic objectives. The transformation from obedient operative to independent moral agent was complete, though Frank didn't yet understand the full implications of his choice. Meanwhile, Margaret was facing her own moral complexities as wounded German soldiers began arriving at her field hospital. The boys wore different uniforms and spoke a different language, but their wounds were identical to those of Allied soldiers. They bled the same red blood, cried for their mothers in the same anguished voices, and faced death with the same mixture of fear and courage. Sister Catherine had prepared the medical staff for this moment, reminding them of their professional obligations to treat all patients regardless of nationality or political affiliation. But the emotional reality of caring for enemy soldiers proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. These were the same forces that had killed their comrades, destroyed their equipment, and threatened the success of the invasion. Margaret found herself assigned to treat a young German officer who had been severely wounded by shrapnel from an Allied artillery shell. He was perhaps 22 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes that reminded her painfully of Frank. The officer spoke broken English, apologizing repeatedly for the trouble he was causing while Margaret worked to stabilize his condition. The young German told her about his home in Bavaria, about mountains covered with snow and villages where church bells marked the passage of peaceful days. He spoke of his fiancée, a girl named Greta, who taught school in their hometown, showing Margaret a photograph that had been stained with his blood. The picture revealed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, someone who could have been Margaret's sister or friend under different circumstances. As Margaret worked to save the German officer's life, she struggled with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. This boy was the enemy, part of the machine that had plunged the world into war and caused immeasurable suffering, but he was also someone's son, someone's beloved, a young man who had probably never wanted to be a soldier any more than the Allied boys she had been treating. The moral complexity of her situation deepened when the German officer asked about the battle's progress, clearly hoping for news that his side was holding its positions. Margaret found herself in the impossible position of comforting an enemy soldier while knowing that his recovery would return him to combat against her own countrymen. Every life she saved created new moral dilemmas that had no clear solutions. Her internal struggle was interrupted by the arrival of more casualties, both Allied and German, their wounds requiring immediate attention. Margaret moved between patients without regard for the uniforms they wore, her medical training overriding political considerations. Pain recognized no nationality, and healing acknowledged no borders. In the democracy of suffering, all patients were equal. But other medical personnel struggled more visibly with the moral complexities of treating enemy soldiers. Margaret watched nurses who provided excellent care to Allied patients become cold and mechanical when dealing with German wounded. She understood their feelings without judging them, recognizing that war created impossible situations where any choice could be justified or condemned depending on perspective. The tension came to a head when a badly wounded German soldier was brought in during the same period as several Allied casualties. Resources were limited, and decisions had to be made about treatment priorities. The German boy was more severely injured but had a better chance of survival with immediate surgery. The Allied soldiers were more stable but would deteriorate without prompt attention. Margaret found herself making the kind of decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She chose to treat the German soldier first, knowing that his wounds were more life-threatening and that delay would almost certainly result in his death. The choice was medically sound but emotionally devastating, as she watched Allied boys suffer while she worked to save an enemy soldier's life. The decision sparked controversy within the medical team, with some personnel questioning Margaret's priorities and others defending her medical judgment. Sister Catherine supported Margaret's choice, pointing out that medical ethics required treating the most severely injured patients first regardless of other considerations. But the incident revealed the moral fault lines that ran through even the most humanitarian efforts during wartime. As Margaret worked through the night, she thought about Frank and wondered how he would judge her choices. Would he understand the complexity of her situation, or would he see her treatment of enemy soldiers as a betrayal of Allied cause? The questions had no easy answers, but they forced Margaret to examine her own beliefs about duty, compassion, and the meaning of healing in a world gone mad. Frank's modified mission began at midnight, with his team approaching the hospital under cover of darkness. The building loomed before them like a monument to moral ambiguity, its red crosses visible even in the dim starlight. Frank could see German sentries posted at the entrances, their presence confirming that the facility was indeed being used for military purposes beyond medical treatment. The infiltration proceeded according to plan, with Frank's team neutralizing the guards silently and efficiently. But as they moved through the hospital corridors, Frank was struck by the human reality of what they were doing. Wounded soldiers lay in beds on either side, some sleeping peacefully while others moaned in pain. Nurses moved between patients with the same dedication Margaret showed, providing comfort and care regardless of the danger surrounding them. Frank reached the communication center to find 2 German radio operators working frantically to coordinate defensive positions throughout the region. The intelligence being transmitted could help German forces mount more effective resistance against Allied advances. potentially costing hundreds or thousands of Allied lives. Frank understood the strategic importance of stopping those transmissions, but he also saw the operators as young men doing their duty under impossible circumstances. The capture operation proceeded without the explosive violence Frank had originally planned. His team secured the communication equipment intact while taking the German operators prisoner, preserving both the intelligence value of the facility and the lives of everyone inside. But the modified mission took longer than anticipated, increasing the risk of discovery and compromise. As Frank's team prepared to withdraw with their prisoners and captured intelligence, German reinforcements arrived at the hospital. The facility was surrounded within minutes, trapping Frank's team inside a building full of wounded soldiers and medical personnel. The situation had become a nightmare scenario where any attempt to fight their way out would result in massive civilian casualties. Frank found himself facing the consequences of his moral choices in the most direct possible way. His decision to preserve the hospital had placed his team in mortal danger while creating a hostage situation that could result in the deaths of innocent people. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, forcing him to confront the true cost of trying to wage war with clean hands. The standoff that followed would test Frank's leadership, his team's loyalty, and his own understanding of what it meant to serve a cause greater than himself. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her work just miles away, unaware that the man she loved was trapped in a situation that would reveal the true nature of the choices war demanded from those who fought it. The convergence of their separate struggles was approaching, though neither yet understood how completely their individual wars would become intertwined. The secrets Frank had carried and the moral complexities Margaret had encountered were about to collide in ways that would challenge everything they believed about love, duty, and the price of survival in a world at war. War. The German commander who arrived at the hospital was a man named Colonel Heinrich Weber, a career officer whose weathered face bore the marks of 4 years of brutal warfare. He had lost his eldest son at Stalingrad and his younger brother in the North African campaign. Losses that had hardened him into something beyond mere military efficiency. Weber understood that the war was lost, that Germany was fighting a desperate, delaying action against inevitable defeat. But his duty remained unchanged regardless of strategic realities. Weber's voice echoed through the hospital corridors as he addressed the trapped Allied team through a makeshift loudspeaker. He spoke in heavily accented English, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. The message was simple and stark. Surrender immediately or watch the hospital burn with everyone inside. Weber had neither the time nor the patience for extended negotiations. His forces were needed elsewhere, and he would not allow a handful of Allied operatives to tie down an entire battalion. Frank listened to the ultimatum while studying the faces of his teammates, men who had followed him into this impossible situation based on their trust in his judgment. Each of them understood that surrender meant interrogation, torture, and eventual execution, but fighting their way out would require using the wounded soldiers and medical staff as human shields, a choice that would violate everything they claimed to be fighting for. The hospital's chief surgeon, a middle-aged German doctor named Klaus Brenner, approached Frank during the tense standoff that followed Weber's ultimatum. Brenner spoke fluent English, having studied medicine at Johns Hopkins before the war transformed him from healer to reluctant participant in military operations. His hands shook slightly as he offered to mediate between the trapped commandos and the German forces surrounding the building. Brenner's proposal was both desperate and ingenious. He suggested that Frank's team could escape through the hospital's morgue, which connected to a series of underground tunnels originally designed for waste disposal. The route would be dangerous and uncertain, but it offered the possibility of avoiding a firefight that would turn the hospital into a charnel house. In exchange, Frank would need to leave behind the captured German radio operators and the intelligence materials his team had secured. Frank found himself weighing lives against strategic objectives with the kind of cold calculation he had learned to despise. The intelligence his team had captured could save hundreds of Allied soldiers by revealing German defensive positions and communication codes, But preserving that advantage would require a battle that would almost certainly kill innocent medical personnel and wounded soldiers who had no part in the larger conflict. The decision revealed how completely Frank had changed since those innocent days in Central Park with Margaret. The idealistic young journalist who had believed in clear moral choices now understood that war created situations where every option carried terrible consequences. Frank agreed to Brenner's proposal, choosing to preserve innocent lives, even though it meant abandoning a strategic advantage that could have shortened the war. The escape through the morgue was a descent into literal and metaphorical darkness. Frank's team crawled through tunnels barely wide enough for a grown man, their progress measured in inches rather than feet. The air was thick with the smell of death and decay, a reminder of the human cost of the conflict raging above their heads. Behind them, the hospital remained intact, its patients and staff unaware of how close they had come to becoming casualties of a battle they had never chosen to fight. Frank emerged from the tunnels hours later, covered in filth and haunted by the choices he had made. His team had survived, but they had also failed in their primary mission. The German communication hub remained operational, continuing to coordinate defensive operations that would cost Allied lives in the days to come. Frank understood that his decision to preserve the hospital had been morally correct but strategically costly, a compromise that satisfied neither his conscience nor his duty. Meanwhile, Margaret was discovering that moral complexity could infect even the most humanitarian efforts. The German officer she had saved, the young man who reminded her so painfully of Frank, had recovered enough to be transferred to a prisoner of war camp. As he was loaded onto a medical transport, he pressed a letter into her hands, asking her to mail it to his fiancée in Bavaria if the opportunity ever arose. The letter was written in German, but Margaret could make out enough words to understand its basic content. The young officer was telling his beloved about the Allied nurse who had saved his life, describing her kindness and professionalism in terms that made Margaret uncomfortable with their gratitude. He wrote about his hope that someday, when the war ended, there might be a world where such kindness could exist without the context of conflict and suffering. Margaret kept the letter, knowing she might never have the opportunity to fulfill the dying soldier's request, but unable to simply discard his final message to the woman he loved. The piece of paper became another weight in her collection of moral burdens, a tangible reminder of the human connections that persisted even in the midst of mechanized slaughter. The arrival of new casualties interrupted her contemplation, bringing fresh reminders of war's relentless appetite for young lives. Among the wounded was an American soldier who had been shot by a sniper while trying to rescue a fallen comrade. The bullet had shattered his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. At 19 years old, he would spend the rest of his life confined to a wheelchair, his dreams of returning to the family farm in Iowa reduced to memories of what might have been. Margaret worked to stabilize his condition while struggling with the knowledge that some wounds could never truly heal. Medical science could keep the boy alive, but it couldn't restore his mobility or repair the psychological damage of watching his friends die around him. These were the victories that felt like defeats, the saves that highlighted the limitations of even the most skilled medical intervention. The boy's name was Danny, and he came from a town so small it didn't appear on most maps. He told Margaret about wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, about harvest festivals where entire communities came together to celebrate another successful growing season. His voice carried the flat vowels of the Midwest, an accent that reminded Margaret of the America she had left behind when she sailed for England. Danny's injuries required surgery that the field hospital wasn't equipped to perform. He would need to be evacuated to a more advanced medical facility, probably in England, where specialists could attempt to minimize the damage to his spinal cord. The evacuation would likely be his last glimpse of the European continent, the end of his war and the beginning of a lifetime of adaptation to his new physical reality. As Margaret prepared Danny for transport, she found herself thinking about the ripple effects of individual casualties. His parents would receive a telegram informing them that their son had been wounded in action, but they wouldn't understand the full implications until he returned home. His girlfriend, a high school sweetheart named Sarah, would face the choice of staying with a man whose future had been fundamentally altered by enemy fire. His younger brother, who had been planning to enlist on his 18th birthday, might reconsider his eagerness to join the fight. Each wounded soldier represented a family forever changed, a community that would bear the scars of war long after the fighting ended. Margaret was beginning to understand that the casualties she treated were just the visible evidence of a conflict that was reshaping entire societies, altering the trajectory of countless lives in ways that would echo through generations. The weight of this realization settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every life she saved was precious and important, but the scale of the destruction surrounding her made individual victories seem almost insignificant. For every Danny she helped, there were hundreds of other young men whose names she would never know, whose stories would end in unmarked graves scattered across the European countryside. Frank was grappling with similar questions about individual significance versus strategic necessity. His team had regrouped at a new safe house, an abandoned mill where they could plan their next operation while processing the lessons learned from their failed mission at the hospital. The captured intelligence had been lost, but Frank's men had gained valuable experience in the kind of moral decision-making that conventional military training never addressed. The safe house was located near a small French village that had been liberated by Allied forces just days earlier. Frank could see the villagers emerging from their hiding places, tentatively beginning to rebuild their lives after 4 years of German occupation. Children played in the streets for the first time since 1940, their laughter providing a sharp contrast to the sound of distant artillery that continued to mark the front lines. Frank established contact with local resistance fighters who had survived the German occupation through a combination of luck, cunning, and moral compromise. Their leader was a woman named Marie, whose husband had been executed by German forces for harboring Allied airmen. She had continued his work despite the constant threat of discovery, organizing sabotage operations that had helped prepare for the invasion. Marie's story revealed the complex moral landscape that had defined life in occupied Europe. She had been forced to make choices between resistance and survival, between protecting her own family and helping strangers who might be Allied agents or German spies. Some of her decisions had saved lives. Others had resulted in tragedy for people she cared about. The war had taught her that moral purity was a luxury that few could afford when survival itself required constant compromise. Frank recognized in Marie's experience a reflection of his own transformation from idealistic journalist to pragmatic intelligence operative. Both had discovered that serving a greater cause sometimes required actions that violated personal principles. Both had learned to live with the weight of decisions that had no clearly right answers, choices that would haunt them long after the fighting ended. The conversation with Marie forced Frank to confront questions about his own future that he had been avoiding since leaving New York. When the war ended, assuming he survived, what kind of man would return to Margaret? The gentle writer who had shared umbrellas in Central Park no longer existed, replaced by someone who could kill without hesitation and lie with practiced ease. Would Margaret be able to love the person he had become? Or would she be horrified by the transformation war had wrought in the man she remembered? These questions became more urgent as Frank received new intelligence suggesting that the war might end sooner than anyone had expected. German resistance was crumbling faster than Allied planners had anticipated, and rumors circulated about peace negotiations that could bring the fighting to a halt within months rather than years. The prospect of survival, which had seemed so remote during the darkest days of the occupation, was suddenly becoming a realistic possibility. But survival brought its own complications. Frank would need to explain 4 years of absence to Margaret, accounting for time spent in activities that remained classified at the highest levels of government. He would need to rebuild a relationship with a woman who had also been changed by her wartime experiences, who had seen and done things that the innocent nursing student from New York could never have imagined. The letters Frank had written but never sent filled an entire notebook, a record of thoughts and experiences he had never shared with the woman he loved. Reading through those pages, Frank realized how much distance had grown between them, how many secrets and silences would need to be bridged if they were to find their way back to each other. The war had made them both into different people, and there was no guarantee that their new selves would be compatible with the love they had shared in peacetime. Margaret was facing similar questions about her own transformation and its implications for her relationship with Frank. The woman who returned to New York would bear invisible scars from her service in Europe, memories of suffering and death that would never entirely fade. She had learned to make life and death decisions under pressure, to function effectively while surrounded by chaos and violence, to find meaning in small acts of healing even when larger forces seemed bent on destruction. These skills would serve her well in peacetime nursing, but they also represented a fundamental change in her character that Frank might not understand or appreciate. The gentle, optimistic young woman he had fallen in love with still existed, but she had been tempered by experiences that had revealed reserves of strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Margaret wondered if Frank would recognize the person she was becoming, if he would be able to love someone who had been shaped by war as much as by the peaceful dreams they had once shared. The letters she continued to write but couldn't send grew longer and more complex, filled with observations and experiences that seemed impossible to explain. To someone who hadn't lived through the same transformation, the convergence of their separate wars was approaching more rapidly than either realized. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces in their sector were preparing for a final withdrawal, abandoning positions they could no longer hold against sustained Allied pressure. The liberation of the region was imminent, bringing with it the possibility that Frank and Margaret's paths might cross in ways neither expected. But before that reunion could occur, both would face final tests that would determine not only their individual survival but the kind of people they would be when the war finally ended. Margaret would need to make choices about medical treatment that would challenge her deepest beliefs about healing and humanity. Frank would need to decide whether his loyalty belonged to the mission that had defined his war or to the principles that had shaped his peacetime identity. The answers to these questions would determine whether their love could survive the secrets and transformations that war had imposed upon them both. The idealistic young couple who had fallen in love under a shared umbrella in Central Park no longer existed, replaced by two people who had learned hard lessons about the price of survival in a world at war. Whether these new versions of themselves could find their way back to love remained an open question, one that would be answered in the chaos and uncertainty of war's final days. The breakthrough came at dawn on June 12th when Allied forces finally shattered the last German defensive line in the sector. Margaret watched from the window of her field hospital as columns of American tanks rolled past, their crews waving and shouting with the kind of joy that only comes from knowing you've survived something that should have killed you. The sound of their engines mixed with church bells ringing from liberated villages, creating a symphony of victory that seemed to wash away some of the darkness of the past week. But victory brought its own complications. German forces were retreating in disorder, leaving behind wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved and civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. Margaret found herself treating a steady stream of casualties that included not only Allied soldiers but German prisoners, French resistance fighters, and ordinary villagers whose only crime had been living in the path of war. Among the prisoners was a German medical officer named Captain Ernst Hoffmann, who had been captured while trying to evacuate wounded from an overrun field hospital. Hoffmann spoke excellent English and possessed medical skills that were desperately needed as the casualty count continued to climb. Margaret found herself working alongside the enemy doctor, their shared commitment to healing temporarily overriding the political divisions that had brought them to this moment. Hoffmann was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and tired eyes that held the same haunted expression Margaret had learned to recognize in veteran medical personnel. He had been treating wounded soldiers since the invasion of Poland in 1939, watching young men die in languages he sometimes didn't understand but whose pain he always recognized. The war had marked him in ways that transcended nationality or uniform. Working beside Hoffman forced Margaret to confront the arbitrary nature of the labels that defined enemies and allies. His surgical technique was flawless, his bedside manner gentle and reassuring. Under different circumstances, he might have been a colleague she respected, perhaps even a friend. But the uniforms they wore and the flags they served had placed them on opposite sides of a conflict that had consumed millions of lives. The collaboration between Margaret and Hoffman created tension within the medical unit, with some personnel questioning the wisdom of trusting an enemy officer with access to wounded Allied soldiers. But Sister Catherine supported the arrangement, pointing out that medical emergencies required all available skilled hands, regardless of their political affiliations. The Hippocratic Oath recognized no national boundaries, and healing acknowledged no flags. As they worked together through the long hours of June 12th, Margaret and Hoffman shared stories that revealed the universal nature of their experiences. Both had seen too much death, treated too many boys who should have been playing sports or courting sweethearts instead of bleeding on foreign soil. Both had learned to compartmentalize their emotions, to function professionally, while surrounded by suffering that threatened to overwhelm any normal person's capacity for compassion. Hoffman told Margaret about his son, a boy named Klaus who had been killed at Monte Cassino while serving as a radio operator with the German army. The boy had been 21 years old, just graduated from university with plans to become a teacher. His death had broken something fundamental in Hoffman's relationship with the war, transforming him from a committed military officer into someone who simply endured each day until it ended. Margaret shared her own struggles with the moral complexities of wartime medicine, describing the impossible choices she had been forced to make about treatment priorities and resource allocation. She spoke about the American boys she had watched die despite her best efforts, about the weight of responsibility that came with holding someone's life in your hands while shells exploded nearby. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of new casualties, victims of a German artillery barrage that had caught a column of Allied vehicles on an exposed stretch of road. The wounded included both American soldiers and French civilians who had been celebrating their liberation when the shells began falling. Margaret and Hoffman worked side by side to stabilize the most critically injured, their shared focus on saving lives temporarily erasing the political divisions that separated them. Among the casualties was a young French girl named Amélie, perhaps 8 years old, who had been struck by shrapnel while playing in her family's garden. The metal fragments had punctured her lung and severed an artery in her leg, injuries that required immediate surgery if she was to survive. Margaret began the delicate work of removing the shrapnel while Hoffman assisted, their teamwork as smooth as if they had been practicing together for years. The surgery lasted 3 hours, with both Margaret and Hoffman pushing their skills to the limit to save a child who represented everything they were supposedly fighting to protect. When Amélie's breathing finally stabilized and her pulse grew stronger, both doctors felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended the political context of their collaboration. They had saved a life together, proving that healing could bridge even the deepest divisions created by war. But their moment of shared triumph was shattered by the arrival of American military police who had been ordered to separate German prisoners from Allied medical personnel. Captain Hoffman was to be transferred immediately to a prisoner of war camp, regardless of the medical emergencies that still required his attention. The decision represented military necessity overriding medical ethics, a reminder that even the most humanitarian activities remained subordinate to strategic considerations. Margaret watched Hoffman being led away in handcuffs, knowing that his departure would leave her medical team short-handed during one of the busiest periods since the invasion began. But more than the practical concerns, she felt a sense of loss at seeing a skilled colleague and temporary friend reduced to the status of enemy prisoner. The war's capacity for creating arbitrary divisions between people who should have been natural allies never ceased to amaze and sadden her. 20 miles away, Frank was witnessing his own version of war's moral complexity as German resistance finally collapsed throughout the sector. His team had been ordered to advance with the front-line troops, gathering intelligence about German defensive positions and communication networks that might be useful in future operations. But the reality of the German retreat was far messier than the strategic reports suggested. Frank found himself in a small Norman town that had changed hands 3 times during the past week, its buildings scarred by artillery and its streets littered with the debris of mechanized warfare. The German garrison had withdrawn during the night, leaving behind wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved and civilians who had collaborated with the occupation authorities. The arriving American forces faced the complex task of sorting through the population to identify genuine threats while avoiding reprisals against innocent people who had simply tried to survive under impossible circumstances. The town's mayor, a man named Pierre Dubois, approached Frank's team with information about German collaborators who had betrayed resistance members to the occupation authorities. Dubois had maintained a careful neutrality during the occupation, but now he was eager to prove his loyalty to the liberation forces by providing intelligence about his neighbors' wartime activities. His list included names of people who had informed on resistance activities, sold supplies to German forces, and provided other forms of cooperation with the occupying army. Frank found himself in the uncomfortable position of evaluating accusations that could result in summary executions or lengthy imprisonment for people whose motivations he couldn't fully understand. Some of the alleged collaborators might have been genuine Nazi sympathizers who deserved punishment for their crimes. Others might have been ordinary people who had made compromises with the occupation authorities simply to protect their families or keep their businesses operating. The moral complexity of the situation was illustrated by the case of Henri Moreau, a baker who had supplied bread to German soldiers throughout the occupation. Dubois accused Moreau of collaboration, pointing out that he had accepted German currency and served enemy personnel in his shop. But Moreau's defense revealed a more complicated reality. He had also secretly provided bread to resistance members and had hidden Jewish families in his cellar during German roundups. His cooperation with the occupation authorities had been a cover for more significant acts of resistance. Frank's investigation of Moreau's case revealed the impossible choices that ordinary people had faced throughout the occupation. Refusing to serve German soldiers would have resulted in the closure of his bakery and probably his arrest. But providing services to the occupation forces made him appear to be a collaborator in the eyes of his neighbors. Moreau had navigated these contradictory pressures by maintaining a public facade of cooperation while secretly supporting resistance activities, a strategy that had kept him alive but now threatened to destroy his reputation. The complexity of cases like Moreau's forced Frank to confront the limitations of his own understanding of occupied Europe's moral landscape. From his perspective as an American intelligence operative, the distinctions between collaboration and resistance seemed clear and absolute. But the reality experienced by people who had lived through 4 years of occupation was far more nuanced, filled with compromises and accommodations that defied simple moral judgments. Frank's team spent days interviewing townspeople and reviewing evidence of wartime activities, trying to separate genuine collaborators from people who had simply done what was necessary to survive. The process revealed the extent to which the occupation had corrupted normal social relationships, turning neighbors into informants and friends into potential threats. Trust had become a luxury that few could afford, and survival had required moral flexibility that would be difficult to explain to people who had never faced such choices. The investigation was complicated by the arrival of French resistance members who had emerged from hiding to settle scores with people they considered traitors. Some of their accusations were based on solid evidence of genuine collaboration, but others seemed motivated by personal grudges or political rivalries that predated the war. Frank found himself trying to maintain order while former resistance fighters demanded immediate justice for perceived betrayals. The situation came to a head when a group of resistance members attempted to execute Henri Moreau without trial, dragging him from his bakery while his wife and children screamed in terror. Frank's team intervened to prevent the lynching, but the incident highlighted the depth of anger and suspicion that liberation had unleashed in communities throughout the region. The end of the occupation had not brought peace, but rather a new phase of conflict as people struggled to define justice and retribution in a world where moral boundaries had been blurred beyond recognition. Frank's intervention on Moreau's behalf created tension with the resistance members, who questioned his authority to interfere in French internal affairs. Their leader, a man named Jean-Baptiste who had lost his father to German execution, argued that Americans couldn't understand the moral complexities of life under occupation. Frank's attempts to impose American concepts of due process and fair trial seemed naive to people who had lived through years of arbitrary violence and systematic oppression. The confrontation with Jean-Baptiste forced Frank to examine his own assumptions about justice and moral authority. As an intelligence operative, he had learned to make pragmatic decisions based on strategic necessity rather than abstract principles. But as an American, he retained faith in legal processes and individual rights that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the chaotic aftermath of liberation. The gap between his idealistic beliefs and the harsh realities of post-occupation Europe was becoming impossible to bridge. Meanwhile, Margaret was discovering that liberation brought its own medical challenges as displaced populations began moving throughout the region. Refugees who had been hiding in forests and caves emerged seeking medical treatment for injuries and illnesses that had gone untreated during the occupation. Former forced laborers from Eastern Europe attempted to make their way home, often in poor health from years of inadequate nutrition and brutal working conditions. The roads were filled with people seeking lost family members, medical care, or simply a safe place to rest. The refugee crisis overwhelmed Margaret's field hospital, which had been designed to treat combat casualties rather than the complex medical needs of displaced civilians. Malnutrition was widespread, creating conditions that made patients vulnerable to infections that would normally be treatable. Tuberculosis and other communicable diseases spread rapidly through refugee camps that lacked proper sanitation facilities. Children suffered from developmental problems caused by years of inadequate nutrition during critical growth periods. Margaret found herself treating conditions that had more to do with the broader humanitarian crisis than with combat injuries. A Polish woman who had been forced to work in a German factory presented with lung damage caused by industrial chemicals. A French man who had hidden in a cave for 2 years suffered from vitamin deficiency diseases that had left him partially blind. An elderly Jewish woman who had survived in hiding showed signs of psychological trauma that manifested in physical symptoms Margaret struggled to understand. The complexity of these cases required Margaret to expand her understanding of medicine beyond the trauma surgery that had dominated her wartime experience. She began working with other medical personnel to develop treatment protocols for malnutrition, infectious diseases, and psychological trauma. The work was less dramatic than battlefield surgery, but equally challenging, requiring patience and creativity to address problems that had no quick solutions. The refugee crisis also created security challenges that complicated Margaret's medical work. German soldiers who had deserted their units mixed with legitimate refugees, sometimes using false identities to avoid capture. Intelligence officers from various Allied nations moved through the refugee camps seeking information about German military activities and war crimes. The camps became centers of espionage and counter-espionage that made medical personnel unwitting participants in continuing intelligence operations. Margaret's hospital received visits from military intelligence officers who questioned patients about their experiences during the occupation. Some refugees were eager to provide information about German atrocities they had witnessed, while others remained suspicious of any official authority after years of persecution. Margaret found herself caught between her medical obligation to protect patient confidentiality and military demands for intelligence that might be crucial to ongoing operations. The intelligence activities created ethical dilemmas that Margaret had never anticipated during her medical training. Should she report conversations with patients that might contain militarily useful information? Did her duty to heal extend to protecting German deserters who sought medical treatment? How should she respond to patients who had committed crimes during the occupation but now needed medical care? These questions had no clear answers, but they required immediate decisions that would affect both individual lives and larger military objectives. The moral complexity of her situation deepened when Margaret discovered that one of her patients, a young man claiming to be a French resistance fighter, was actually a German intelligence officer attempting to gather information about Allied medical facilities. The man had been wounded during the German retreat and had assumed a false identity to avoid capture. His deception was revealed only when he began asking detailed questions about hospital security procedures and communication systems. Margaret's discovery of the German spy created a crisis that highlighted the blurred boundaries between medical care and military security. The man needed continued medical treatment for wounds that could prove fatal without proper care. But he also represented a security threat that could endanger the entire medical facility and its patients. Margaret found herself forced to choose between her medical oath to treat all patients and her duty to protect Allied personnel from enemy intelligence operations. The decision was made more difficult by the German officer's youth and apparent sincerity. He was perhaps 23 years old, with the kind of earnest face that reminded Margaret of the American boys she had treated throughout the campaign. Under interrogation, he revealed that he had been ordered to gather intelligence about Allied medical capabilities, but he also expressed genuine gratitude for the medical care he had received. His situation illustrated the human reality behind enemy uniforms, challenging Margaret's ability to maintain clear distinctions between friend and foe. Sister Catherine ultimately made the decision to transfer the German officer to military custody while ensuring that he continued to receive necessary medical treatment. The compromise satisfied both medical ethics and security requirements, but it left Margaret with uncomfortable questions about the relationship between healing and warfare. Could medical neutrality exist in the context of total war, or were all activities ultimately subordinate to military necessity? These questions became more pressing as Margaret learned about her next assignment. Allied forces were preparing for the final push toward Germany itself, and medical personnel were needed to support the advance into enemy territory. Margaret would be part of a mobile hospital unit that would follow close behind the front lines, treating casualties while advancing deeper into the heart of Nazi Germany. The assignment would place her closer to Frank than she had been since leaving New York, though neither yet knew how close their paths would soon converge. The prospect of entering Germany itself filled Margaret with conflicting emotions. She felt pride in contributing to the final defeat of Nazi tyranny, but she also dreaded the human cost of the battles that lay ahead. German forces would be fighting for their homeland with the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. The casualties would be enormous on both sides, and medical personnel would face challenges that made the Normandy campaign seem manageable by comparison. Frank was receiving his own orders for the advance into Germany, instructions that would place him in the vanguard of intelligence operations designed to capture German officials and secure enemy documents before they could be destroyed. His team would be operating in hostile territory where every civilian might be a potential enemy and every building could conceal a sniper or booby trap. The mission would require all the skills he had developed during his time in occupied France, but the stakes would be higher and the margin for error smaller than anything he had previously experienced. The convergence toward Germany meant that Frank and Margaret were approaching the climax of their separate wars, though neither understood how completely their individual struggles would soon become intertwined. The secrets that had defined Frank's wartime service and the moral complexities that had shaped Margaret's medical career were about to collide in ways that would test not only their individual courage, but the foundation of their love itself. The final phase of the war would demand everything they had learned about survival, duty, and the price of serving causes greater than themselves. But it would also offer the possibility of reunion and redemption, the chance to discover whether love could survive the transformations that war had imposed upon them both. The answers to these questions lay ahead, hidden in the chaos and uncertainty of war's final days, waiting to be revealed when two hearts that had been separated by duty would finally have the chance to beat as one again. The rain began falling on June 15th as Margaret's medical unit prepared for the advance into Germany itself. Each drop seemed to carry the weight of all the blood that had soaked into Norman soil, washing the countryside clean while leaving invisible stains on everyone who had witnessed the past weeks of slaughter. Margaret stood outside her tent, letting the cool water run down her face, trying to wash away memories that no amount of rain could ever cleanse. Her hands had steadied completely now, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to function in chaos. But her eyes carried shadows that hadn't been there when she first sailed from New York, depths that spoke of decisions no young woman should ever have to make. The idealistic nursing student who had dreamed of healing the world had been replaced by someone who understood that some wounds never close, that some pain serves purposes beyond suffering. The mobile hospital unit would advance with the 2nd Armored Division, staying close enough to the front lines to treat casualties quickly while remaining mobile enough to withdraw if German counterattacks threatened their position. Margaret's equipment had been reduced to absolute essentials, medical supplies that could be packed and moved within minutes when orders came to advance or retreat. Sister Catherine gathered the medical team for their final briefing before crossing into German territory. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had supervised battlefield medicine since the Great War, but Margaret could hear the underlying tension that affected even the most experienced personnel. Entering Germany meant treating casualties in the heart of enemy territory where every building might conceal snipers and every road could be mined or booby-trapped. The wounded they would encounter would include not only Allied soldiers but German civilians caught in the path of mechanized warfare, children injured by artillery bombardments, elderly people trapped in burning buildings, women and men who had never worn uniforms but found themselves victims of a conflict they couldn't escape or control. Margaret's medical oath required her to treat all patients regardless of nationality. But the emotional reality of healing people whose government had started the war created complexities she was still learning to navigate. The advance began before dawn on June 16th with columns of tanks and armored vehicles rolling through morning mist that seemed to rise from the earth like the ghosts of all the young men who had died in these fields. Margaret rode in a converted ambulance, watching the Norman countryside give way to the industrial landscape of northeastern France. Factories stood empty and broken, their windows shattered, and their machinery cannibalized for metal that had been turned into weapons and ammunition. The border crossing into Germany was marked only by a damaged signpost and a cluster of abandoned customs buildings, but Margaret felt the psychological impact of entering enemy territory. This was the homeland of the forces that had occupied France, bombed London, and murdered millions of innocent people throughout Europe. Every mile they advanced brought them deeper into the heart of darkness that had consumed the civilized world. German resistance was sporadic but fierce, consisting mainly of hastily organized defensive positions manned by a mixture of regular army troops, Hitler Youth, and elderly men from the Volkssturm militia. These forces lacked the equipment and training to mount sustained resistance, but they fought with the desperation of people defending their homes and families. The casualties they inflicted were often disproportionate to their military significance. Young men dying to delay an advance that could only be postponed never stopped. Margaret's first German patient was a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, wearing an oversized uniform and carrying identification papers that listed his age as 18. He had been shot through the stomach while manning a roadblock, his wounds severe enough to require immediate surgery if he was to survive. As Margaret worked to repair the damage, she found herself looking into eyes that held the same fear and pain she had seen in countless Allied soldiers. The boy spoke no English, but pain needed no translation. He cried for his mother in the same broken voice Margaret had heard from American and British casualties, his suffering indistinguishable from that of the soldiers she had been treating for months. The uniform he wore had made him an enemy, but the wounds he carried made him simply another young person whose life had been shattered by forces beyond his understanding or control. Treating German casualties created tension within the medical unit, with some personnel struggling to provide compassionate care to members of the forces that had killed their friends and countrymen. Margaret understood their feelings without judging them, recognizing that war created emotional complexities that had no easy solutions. She focused on her medical training, letting professional obligations override personal emotions that threatened to compromise her effectiveness. The German boy survived his surgery but remained unconscious for 3 days, his condition too unstable for transfer to a prisoner of war facility. Margaret found herself checking on him regularly, monitoring his vital signs while wondering about the family that would soon receive notification of his capture. His mother would face the same agonizing uncertainty that plagued families throughout the world, not knowing whether her son was alive, wounded, or dead in some foreign field. Frank's intelligence team was advancing along a parallel route, moving through the same devastated landscape. While pursuing different objectives, their mission involved capturing German communication centers and document repositories before retreating forces could destroy evidence of war crimes and military operations. Frank's expertise in codes and communication systems made him valuable for these operations, but the work required moving even closer to active combat zones than his previous assignments. The German countryside revealed the full extent of the war's impact on civilian populations. Villages stood empty, their inhabitants evacuated or fled before the advancing Allied armies. Farm animals wandered through abandoned fields, their owners gone and their fate uncertain. Houses showed signs of hasty evacuation, with personal belongings scattered and family photographs left behind in the rush to escape the approaching front lines. Frank's team established temporary headquarters in a schoolhouse that had been abandoned so quickly that lessons remained written on blackboards and children's artwork still decorated the walls. The building had been converted into a German communication post during the retreat, with radio equipment and map tables set up in former classrooms. Frank worked to decrypt captured German messages while surrounded by reminders of the normal life that war had displaced. The intelligence work revealed the desperation of German military commanders trying to coordinate a defense with inadequate resources and unreliable communications. Units reported critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Reinforcements that existed only on paper were being assigned to defensive positions that had already been overrun. The German army was disintegrating faster than its leadership could acknowledge, but individual units continued fighting with determination that bordered on fanaticism. Frank's analysis of captured documents revealed information that could accelerate the Allied advance and reduce casualties on both sides. German defensive positions were often undermanned and poorly supplied, vulnerable to coordinated attacks that could break through with minimal losses. Communication breakdowns meant that many German units were operating without current intelligence about Allied movements, making them susceptible to surprise attacks and encirclement. But Frank also discovered evidence of war crimes that filled him with horror and rage. Documents described the systematic murder of civilians, the operation of concentration camps, and the use of forced labor under conditions that amounted to slavery. Reading these reports, Frank understood that the war was about more than territorial conquest or political ideology. It was a struggle between civilization and barbarism, between human dignity and mechanized cruelty. The evidence of Nazi atrocities strengthened Frank's commitment to the mission while deepening his understanding of what victory would require. Defeating Germany militarily was only the beginning. The real challenge would be rebuilding a world where such crimes could never happen again. Frank thought about Margaret, wondering how she would react to the evidence of systematic brutality that he was uncovering. Would she be able to maintain her compassionate approach to healing after learning the full extent of what they were fighting against? Margaret was discovering her own evidence of Nazi crimes as her medical unit advanced deeper into German territory. Refugee camps and labor installations revealed conditions that challenged her understanding of human nature. Prisoners who had survived years of deliberate starvation and abuse required medical care that went far beyond anything she had learned in nursing school. Their physical wounds were severe, but the psychological damage was even more profound and difficult to treat. Working with concentration camp survivors forced Margaret to expand her concept of medical care to include healing that addressed not only physical injuries, but psychological trauma that manifested in ways she struggled to understand. Patients who had survived systematic torture often reacted with terror to medical procedures that should have provided comfort. Simple acts like taking blood pressure or checking reflexes could trigger panic attacks that left patients trembling and unable to communicate. Margaret learned to approach these patients with extraordinary gentleness, moving slowly and explaining every procedure in advance. She discovered that healing required not only medical expertise but psychological sensitivity that acknowledged the depth of trauma these people had experienced. Some survivors were so damaged that they seemed unable to believe that medical care could be provided without hidden motives or sadistic purposes. The work was emotionally exhausting in ways that battlefield surgery had never been. Treating combat casualties involved addressing injuries that were understandable consequences of warfare, but helping concentration camp survivors meant confronting evidence of deliberate cruelty that served no military purpose. Margaret found herself struggling with anger and despair that threatened to compromise her ability to function professionally. Sister Catherine provided guidance during these difficult cases, drawing on her experience from the previous war to help younger medical personnel cope with psychological challenges they had never anticipated. She reminded them that their job was to heal, not to judge or seek revenge. The most effective way to honor the suffering they witnessed was to provide the best possible medical care, demonstrating through their actions that human compassion could triumph over systematic cruelty. The refugee crisis intensified as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany. Displaced persons from throughout Nazi-occupied Europe had been liberated from camps and forced labor installations, but they often lacked the resources to return home or even to survive without continued assistance. Many were in poor health from years of inadequate nutrition and brutal treatment. Others had no homes to return to, their families murdered, and their communities destroyed. Margaret's medical unit found itself treating patients whose injuries told stories of systematic abuse that stretched back years. A Polish woman showed signs of medical experiments that had left her permanently disabled. A French man bore scars from repeated beatings that had been administered not as punishment for specific infractions, but as part of a deliberate program of dehumanization. A Jewish child displayed symptoms of malnutrition so severe that normal development had been permanently impaired. Each patient represented not only individual suffering but evidence of crimes that challenged Margaret's faith in human nature. She had entered the war believing that healing could overcome hatred, that medical care could serve as a bridge between enemies. But the evidence of deliberate cruelty she was encountering suggested that some forms of evil were too profound to be addressed through compassion alone. The psychological impact of treating Nazi victims was compounded by the need to continue providing medical care to German casualties, including soldiers who might have participated in the atrocities Margaret was witnessing. Professional medical ethics required her to treat all patients equally, but emotional reality made it difficult to provide compassionate care to people who might have been responsible for the suffering she was seeing in concentration camp survivors. Margaret found herself making distinctions that had no basis in medical training but seemed necessary for psychological survival. Young German soldiers who had been drafted into military service received the same quality of care as Allied casualties, but she struggled to maintain professional composure when treating SS officers or other personnel who had been directly involved in running concentration camps or implementing Nazi racial policies. The moral complexity of these situations was illustrated by the case of a German doctor who was brought to Margaret's field hospital after being wounded during a failed attempt to destroy evidence at a nearby medical facility. Initial intelligence suggested that the doctor had been involved in medical experiments on prisoners, but his injuries were severe enough to require immediate surgery if he was to survive. Margaret found herself operating on a man who might have tortured and killed innocent people in the name of medical research. Her training required her to provide the best possible care regardless of the patient's background, but her conscience rebelled against the idea of saving someone who had violated every principle of medical ethics. The surgery proceeded successfully, but Margaret struggled with questions about whether healing could ever be morally neutral in circumstances where patients might be war criminals. Frank was facing his own moral dilemmas as his intelligence work revealed the full scope of Nazi crimes and the complicity of ordinary Germans in their implementation. Documents captured from government offices showed that knowledge of concentration camps and mass murder had extended far beyond the SS and other specialized units. Local officials had participated in deportations, business leaders had profited from slave labor, medical professionals had provided legitimacy for racial theories that justified genocide. The evidence challenged Frank's assumptions about the nature of evil and the extent to which ordinary people could become complicit in systematic atrocities. He had entered the war believing that Nazi ideology was imposed on unwilling populations by a small group of fanatics. But captured documents suggested that the crimes he was investigating had required widespread cooperation from people who should have known better, but chose collaboration over resistance. Frank's work brought him into contact with German civilians who claimed ignorance of Nazi atrocities while living within miles of concentration camps. Their denials seemed impossible to believe, but Frank recognized the psychological mechanisms that allowed people to ignore evidence of crimes they felt powerless to stop. The human capacity for self-deception was as troubling as the evidence of deliberate cruelty, suggesting that preventing future atrocities would require more than defeating military forces. The intelligence work also revealed the extent to which German scientific and medical institutions had been corrupted by Nazi ideology. Universities had provided intellectual justification for racial theories that legitimized mass murder. Medical schools had trained doctors who conducted experiments on prisoners. Engineering programs had designed more efficient methods of killing large numbers of people. The corruption of knowledge and healing institutions struck Frank as particularly horrifying, representing a betrayal of human values that went beyond military conquest. Frank thought about Margaret as he processed evidence of medical crimes, wondering how she would react to learning that German doctors had violated every principle of healing in service to Nazi ideology. Would her faith in the medical profession survive knowledge of experiments conducted on prisoners? Could she maintain her commitment to treating all patients equally after learning how German medical personnel had participated in genocide? The questions became more pressing as Frank received intelligence suggesting that his unit and Margaret's medical team were converging on the same geographical area. Allied forces were approaching a major German city that had served as a regional administrative center for Nazi operations. The city contained government buildings, medical facilities, and detention centers that would provide crucial evidence for war crimes prosecutions. Frank's team would be responsible for securing documents and facilities before they could be destroyed by retreating German forces. Margaret's medical unit would be needed to treat both military casualties from the battle for the city and civilian refugees who had been displaced by the fighting. The urban combat expected to occur during the city's capture would create casualties that required immediate medical attention, while the liberation of detention facilities would reveal prisoners requiring specialized treatment for systematic abuse and neglect. The convergence toward the same city meant that Frank and Margaret were approaching a reunion neither had anticipated, under circumstances that would test everything they believed about love, duty, and the possibility of healing in a world that had witnessed unprecedented cruelty. The secrets Frank had carried throughout the war and the moral complexities Margaret had encountered in her medical service were about to collide in ways that would challenge not only their individual understanding of right and wrong, but the foundation of their relationship itself. Frank's final intelligence briefing revealed that the city they were approaching contained facilities that had been central to Nazi medical experiments and racial policies. The evidence his team would capture there could provide crucial documentation for war crimes trials that would attempt to bring justice to the perpetrators of systematic atrocities. But gathering that evidence would require entering facilities where unspeakable crimes had been committed, confronting the full reality of what Allied forces had been fighting to stop. Margaret's medical briefing warned that the prisoners they would encounter in the city's detention facilities would present medical challenges unlike anything they had previously faced. Years of systematic abuse had created conditions that would test every aspect of their medical training and psychological resilience. The work would require not only technical skill but emotional strength to treat patients whose suffering had been deliberately inflicted by people who should have been dedicated to healing rather than harm. Both Frank and Margaret were approaching the climax of their wartime service, the moment when they would confront the full reality of what they had been fighting against. The reunion that awaited them would occur in the shadow of humanity's capacity for both great evil and great good, testing whether love could survive in a world where healing and harm had become so completely intertwined. The city lay ahead, its buildings silhouetted against smoke from burning documents and equipment that retreating German forces were destroying to prevent capture. Within those buildings lay evidence of crimes that would haunt the world's conscience for generations, but also the possibility of justice and healing that could begin to restore faith in human dignity. Frank and Margaret were about to discover whether the love they had shared in peaceful Central Park could survive the revelations that awaited them in the heart of Nazi Germany. The assault on the city began at 4:17 in the morning with a thunderous artillery barrage that shattered windows for miles around. Margaret crouched in the back of her ambulance as shells screamed overhead, their whistling passage marking time like a mechanical heartbeat, counting down to something she couldn't yet comprehend. The mobile hospital had been positioned just outside the city limits, close enough to receive casualties quickly, but far enough to avoid becoming a target for German artillery. Through the ambulance windows, Margaret watched Allied forces pour into the city streets like water through broken dam. Tank treads ground against cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of peaceful commerce, their steel tracks leaving scars that would mark this place forever. Smoke billowed from government buildings where German officials were destroying documents, creating a haze that turned the dawn light an ominous orange. The first casualties arrived within an hour, carried by medics who had advanced with the assault troops. These were different wounds than Margaret had seen before, injuries caused by close-quarters combat in narrow streets where every window might conceal a sniper and every doorway could hide explosives. Burns from flamethrowers mixed with shrapnel from grenades thrown in confined spaces. The urban warfare was creating trauma that challenged every technique Margaret had learned. Among the wounded was a sergeant named Williams, who had been leading his squad through a residential district when machine gun fire erupted from a house filled with elderly German defenders. Williams had been shot through the chest while trying to evacuate civilians from the crossfire, his lungs punctured, but his spirit unbroken. As Margaret worked to stabilize his breathing, Williams kept asking about the German family he had been trying to protect, more concerned with their safety than his own injuries. The sergeant's wounds required surgery that pushed Margaret's skills to their limits. The bullet had missed his heart by millimeters but had damaged blood vessels that needed immediate repair. Margaret worked by artificial light, while explosions echoed through the city, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding their makeshift operating theater. William survived the surgery, but his concern for the German civilians revealed the moral complexity that urban combat created for soldiers trying to distinguish between combatants and innocents. Frank's intelligence team had entered the city with the first wave of assault troops, racing against time to secure government buildings before their contents could be destroyed. The German administrators had been burning documents for hours, but the sheer volume of paperwork had made complete destruction impossible. Frank found himself wading through ankle-deep ashes while searching for documents that had escaped the flames, each surviving page potentially containing evidence of crimes that needed to be documented. The first facility Frank's team secured was a municipal building that had served as headquarters for regional Nazi administration. The offices were filled with filing cabinets and document boxes, some still burning while others remained intact. Frank worked frantically to organize salvage operations, directing his team to prioritize documents related to concentration camps, medical experiments, and forced labor programs. Every minute they delayed meant more evidence disappearing into flames that would protect war criminals from prosecution. The captured documents revealed administrative details that made Nazi crimes seem even more horrifying through their bureaucratic precision. Deportation orders had been filed in triplicate. Medical experiment results had been recorded with scientific thoroughness. Death certificates had been issued for people who had been murdered, creating official records that legitimized systematic killing. The paperwork transformed mass murder into administrative procedure, revealing how evil could hide behind institutional authority. Frank's team discovered correspondence between local officials and concentration camp administrators that documented the complicity of ordinary bureaucrats in genocide. Mayors' offices had coordinated deportations. Hospital administrators had transferred patients to facilities where they were killed. University professors had provided intellectual justification for racial policies that led directly to murder. The evidence showed that Nazi crimes had required cooperation from people throughout German society, not just from specialized killing units. Reading these documents while explosions echoed through the city, Frank struggled with emotions that threatened to compromise his professional effectiveness. The clinical language used to describe atrocities made them seem more rather than less horrifying, as if reducing human suffering to administrative terminology could somehow make it acceptable. Frank thought about Margaret, wondering how she would react to evidence that healing institutions had been corrupted into instruments of deliberate harm. The intelligence work was interrupted when German defenders launched a counterattack aimed at recapturing the government buildings Frank's team was securing. SS troops and Hitler Youth fighters attacked with desperate fury, knowing that the documents being captured would provide evidence for war crimes prosecutions. The battle raged through office corridors and file rooms, with both sides understanding that more than military advantage was at stake. Frank and Margaret's love story began with shared umbrellas and Central Park dreams, but war transformed them both in ways they never could have imagined. When they finally found each other again in the ruins of Nazi Germany, they discovered that the deepest wounds aren't always visible and that sometimes the greatest victory is learning to love the person someone has become, not just who they used to be.